The wind in the San Augustine Basin did not blow so much as it scoured. It carried the taste of alkali dust and the metallic scent of dried sage, stripping the moisture from a man's skin until he felt as brittle as the dead grass under his boots. The sky above was a vast, blinding expanse of blue that felt less like a ceiling and more like a judgment, stretching over a landscape where the mountains in the distance looked like the broken, jagged teeth of an old wolf. Elias Thorne stood by the warped railing of his corral, watching the horizon where the heat shimmer made the earth look like it was dissolving into water. It was a lie. Of course, there was no water out there, only hard-pan clay and the kind of silence that drove lesser men to talk to their horses until they forgot how to speak to people. Elias was 34 years old, though the sun had carved deep lines around his eyes that made him look older. He was a man built of wire and rawhide, competent in the way a tool is competent, worn smooth by use and purpose. He had been on this patch of land for 7 years. He had come here with a wife named Sarah and a dream of cattle that would grow fat on the high desert grass. The grass had withered in the drought of 72, and Sarah had withered with a fever the winter after. Now, the ranch survived by stubbornness more than luck. Elias stayed because leaving felt like an admission that the land had beaten him, and Elias Thorne did not know how to yield. He pulled the brim of his hat lower against the glare. To the east lay the town of Salt Lick, a festering sore on the edge of the territory. It was a collection of raw lumber buildings and canvas tents that clung to the side of a dry wash, a place where civilization had stopped to catch its breath and then died of dysentery. Elias avoided it when he could. The town was built on a social order defined by who belonged and who did not. The gambling hall had glass windows, while the church had a dirt floor. But the same men filled both. The sheriff, a man named Boyd, with a smile that showed too much gum and eyes that showed nothing at all, presided over it with a casual corruption that turned the law into a weapon for the highest bidder. Elias turned his attention back to the post he was mending. He wrapped the wire tight, his leather gloves creaking. He worked alone. He had no hands to help him this season, and the solitude had become a heavy coat he wore without complaint. A disturbance in the distance caught his eye, a dust cloud, small and focused, moving steadily toward the ranch gate. Elias did not reach for the Winchester leaning against the barn wall, but he shifted his weight so that he was no longer leaning. He watched the rider approach. It was a mule train, small and efficient. The lead rider sat on a piebald mare, moving with the easy, fluid grace of a man who had spent more life in a saddle than on a chair. It was Chato. The Apache trader was a figure of practical mystery in the borderlands. He moved between the army forts, the reservation lines, and the remote ranches, trading information as often as he traded goods. He was a man who survived by being useful to everyone and trusted by no one. He wore a faded blue army coat over buckskins, and his dark eyes were constantly moving, reading the terrain, the wind, and the tension in Elias's shoulders. Chato pulled the mare up 10 yards from the fence. The pack mule behind him lowered its head, blowing dust from its nostrils. Elias nodded once. "Chato." "Thorne," the trader replied. His voice was like grinding stones. "Water?" "It was the custom. You did not deny a man water in this country, not unless you were at war. And even then, sometimes you gave it before you killed him." Elias gestured to the trough near the windmill. "Help yourself. Pump is drawing good today." Chato dismounted, his movements stiff but controlled. He led the animals to the water, letting them drink but pulling them back before they gorged themselves sick. He took a long drink from the ladle himself, wiping his mouth with the back of a hand that was scarred and stained with dust. "You are alone," Chato stated. It was not a question. "Usually am," Elias said. "You didn't ride out here to check my census." Chato looked at the house, then back to the empty horizon. "No, I have a problem. I thought perhaps you are a man who can solve problems that require silence." Elias felt a tightening in his gut. Complications in the territory usually involve the law or the lack of it, and neither ended well. "I have enough troubles. Chato, if you have stolen goods, keep riding." The sheriff has been looking for a reason to come out here. Not stolen, Chato said. He walked back to the pack mule. There was a second animal behind it, a small paint horse that Elias had not noticed at first because it was standing in the mule's shadow. On the horse sat a figure wrapped in a heavy, filthy wool blanket. This is a transaction, but not the kind for the general store. Elias narrowed his eyes. What is it? Chato reached up and pulled the blanket back. Elias felt the air leave his lungs. It was a woman, or rather, it was a girl who had been aged into a woman by violence. She looked to be perhaps 20 years old, though it was hard to tell through the grime on her face. Her hair was a matted tangle of dark knots. Her dress was torn at the shoulder, revealing skin that was bruised a mottled purple and yellow. Her wrists were bound to the saddle horn with rawhide strips that had cut into the flesh. But it was her eyes that stopped Elias. They were dark, wide, and utterly frantic. They darted from Elias to the horizon, to the barn, to the ground, never settling, vibrating with the terrified energy of a creature that knows it is about to be hurt. She flinched when Chato moved his hand near her, a sharp, violent jerk of her head that spoke of habit. What is this? Elias asked, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble. You trading in slaves now? Chato. I am trading in survival, Chato said, his face impassive. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded, greasy piece of paper. He held it out. Elias took it. It was a bond note, scrawled in poor handwriting but stamped with an official-looking seal from a magistrate 3 counties over. It detailed a debt of $500 and listed the bearer's right to labor and custody of 1 female indentured servant until such debt was paid. It was a legal fiction, the kind used to traffic women through the mining camps and timber towns where the law turned a blind eye. I took this from a man near Chloride, Chato explained. He was dead. I did not kill him, but I did not mourn him. She was with him, tied to his wagon. So you brought her here? Elias crumpled the paper in his fist. Take her to the fort. Take her to the marshal. The army will see an Indian with a white woman and hang me before I speak, Chato said simply. If I take her to Salt Lick, to your sheriff, look at her. Rancher, do you think Boyd will liberate her? Or will he see a piece of property that has lost its owner? Elias looked at the woman again. She was staring at his boots. Her breathing was shallow and rapid. Her lip was split, a fresh wound that had scabbed over and cracked again. She looked half feral, reduced to raw nerve and instinct. She is known as the biter, Chato said. He sounded almost amused, but his eyes were grim. Men have been selling her fear for profit, passing the bond, using her. She has learned that the only way to keep a piece of herself is to hurt what touches her. Why bring her to me? Elias demanded. I am not a savior. Chato, I am trying to keep cattle alive on dust. Because you are not cruel, Chato said. And because you are alone. You can hide her until she is human again. Or until you can move her north to a place where the law is real. And if I say no? Chato shrugged. Then I leave her in town on my way out. I cannot keep her. It is death for me. I will sell the bond to the saloon keeper. He will pay well. The threat hung in the hot air between them. Elias looked at the woman. If Chato took her to Salt Lick, she would be meat. The town would consume her. The sheriff would likely uphold the bond just to get a cut of her earnings in the back rooms of the gambling hall. Elias felt a cold anger rising in his chest, a familiar fury at the way the world ground the weak into the dirt. He hated this. He hated the trap Chato had sprung on him, but he looked at the woman's wrists, raw and bleeding, and he knew he was caught. He could not stomach what would happen if he turned away. The ghosts of his own failures, the family he hadn't been able to save from the fever, rose up in the silence. How much? Elias asked. The words tasted like bile. For the trouble? For the risk of transport? Chato calculated. $300. I am not buying a person, Elias snapped, his jaw tightening until his teeth ached. I do not buy people. Call it what you want, Chato said. But you must buy the paper. If you do not hold the bond, the next man who comes looking for her can take her legally. You buy the paper to kill the paper. Elias turned on his heel and marched into the small ranch house. He went to the iron box hidden beneath the floorboards under his bed. It was his seed money, his emergency fund, the savings meant for a new well. He counted out the heavy gold coins and the stack of worn banknotes. $300. It was a fortune. It was enough to buy 100 head of good cattle. He walked back out and shoved the money into Chatto's hand. "Give me the bond." Chatto nodded, counting the money quickly before tucking it away. He smoothed the crumpled paper Elias had dropped and handed it back. Then he walked to the woman's horse. "Enjoy. Rancher," Chatto said, stepping back and gathering his reins. "She bites." It was not a jest. It was a warning delivered with the flat certainty of a man who had seen the scars. Chatto mounted his horse. "I will ride south, if anyone asks. I sold a mule in Tucson. Good luck, Thorn." The trader did not look back. He kicked his mare into a trot and disappeared into the shimmery heat, leaving Elias standing in the dust with a feral woman tied to a strange horse. Elias stood still for a long moment. The silence of the ranch returned, but it felt different now. Heavier. He approached the horse slowly. The woman watched him, her body tense, every muscle coiled. She did not plead. She did not cry. She watched him the way a wolf in a trap watches the hunter's knife. "I'm going to cut you loose," Elias said softly. He kept his hands where she could see them. "I'm not going to hurt you." She did not blink. Elias drew the knife from his belt. She flinched, shrinking back against the saddlebags. He paused, letting her see that he wasn't advancing. "Just the ropes," he said. "Just the ropes." He moved in. He reached for the rawhide binding her wrists. He was careful, precise. He sliced through the leather, freeing her hands. "You can get down now," he said, taking a half-step back. "I'll help you." She sat there, frozen. Elias sighed. She was likely stiff from the ride, dehydrated, and terrified. He stepped closer, reaching up to offer his hands to steady her descent. "Come on, I've got you." His hands touched her waist. The reaction was instantaneous. She exploded into motion, a blur of rage and desperation. She didn't pull away. She lunged. Her head snapped down, and her teeth sank into the meat of Elias's forearm, right above the wrist. It wasn't a nip. It was a clamp. She bit down with all the force of a cornered animal fighting for its life. "Damn it!" Elias shouted. The pain was searing, hot and immediate. He staggered back, instinctively jerking his arm away. She held on for a split second, then released, tumbling from the saddle and hitting the dust in a crouch. She scrambled backward, crab walking away from him, her chest heaving. Elias clutched his arm. Blood welled up thick and dark, running down over his hand and dripping onto the dry earth. The bite was deep. She had nearly taken a chunk out of him. He looked at her. She was 10 feet away, backed up against the water trough. Her lips were pulled back, her teeth stained with his blood. She was shaking, but her eyes were defiant. She expected him to strike her. She was waiting for the boot, the fist, the whip. She braced herself for it. Elias stood there, his chest heaving, the adrenaline pounding in his ears. The anger flared white-hot, the instinct to lash out at the thing that had hurt him. He saw the expectation in her eyes. She knew men. She knew what men did when they were hurt. He took a deep breath, forcing the air into his lungs, forcing his heart to slow. He looked at the blood on his arm, then at the terror beneath the rage in her face. He did not raise his hand. "All right," he said, his voice rough but steady. He didn't move toward her. He stayed where he was. "All right." The woman blinked, confusion flickering through her panic. He hadn't hit her. Elias pulled a bandana from his back pocket and wrapped it tightly around his arm, tying the knot with his teeth and his good hand. "You made your point," he said. "You don't want to be touched. I won't touch you." He turned his back on her, a deliberate choice, exposing his neck to show he didn't view her as a combatant, and walked to the saddlebags on the horse she had ridden. He pulled out a canteen and a tin cup. He poured water into the cup and set it on the ground halfway between them. "Drink," he said. He walked away, heading toward the barn to get the medical kit he kept for the horses. He didn't look back to see if she took it. The afternoon wore on, the sky turning the color of bruised iron as the sun began to dip toward the mountains. The wind picked up, colder now, biting through the thin cotton of Elias's shirt. When he emerged from the barn, his arm bandaged properly and smelling of carbolic acid. The woman was still by the trough. The cup was empty. She was watching him, tracking his movement across the yard. "Wind's coming up," Elias said. He stopped a safe distance away. "It'll freeze tonight. You can't stay out here." She didn't move. "I have a bunkhouse," he said, pointing to a small, weathered structure near the main house. It was where he had stayed when he first built the place, before Sarah arrived. "It's got a stove and a bed. I'll put wood in there. You can bar the door from the inside." He saw her eyes shift to the building. She was weighing the trap against the cold. "I won't come in," Elias said. "You have my word. Not that it means much to you." He walked to the bunkhouse, leaving the door wide open. He carried an armful of split cedar inside and laid a fire in the small potbelly stove. He struck a match and got it going, the smell of wood smoke sharp and clean. He placed a wool blanket on the narrow cot and a bucket of fresh water on the table. Then he walked out. He stopped in the yard and looked at her. "The door has a heavy bolt," he said. "Use it." He went into his own house and closed the door. He moved to the window, watching through the cracked glass. For a long time, nothing happened. The shadows stretched out, turning purple and black. Finally, when the cold became undeniable, the woman moved. She crept toward the bunkhouse, staying low, checking the perimeter. She vanished inside. A moment later, Elias heard the heavy thud of the iron bolt sliding home. Night fell like a hammer. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in an hour. Elias sat at his kitchen table. The oil lamp turned low. His arm throbbed in time with his heartbeat. He looked at the bond paper sitting on the table. $500 of debt. $300 of gold. A human life reduced to arithmetic. He pushed the paper away. He felt a strange, hollow exhaustion. He wasn't a jailer. He wasn't a father. He was just a man who wanted to be left alone. And now he had a tiger in his garden. Outside, the dogs began to bark. It wasn't the lazy barking of dogs baying at a coyote. It was the sharp, aggressive snarl of animals who see a stranger. Elias blew out the lamp instantly. The room plunged into darkness. He moved to the gun rack and took down the Winchester. He levered around into the chamber, the mechanical clack-clack sounding loud in the quiet house. He went to the window. The moon was a sliver, offering little light, but he could see shapes moving near the gate. Riders, 2 of them, maybe 3. They were sitting on their horses, looking at the house. Elias felt a cold knot in his stomach. Had they tracked her? Was this the bond coming to collect? He didn't wait to ask. In this country, you didn't ask strangers their business in the dark. He opened the front door and stepped out onto the porch, the rifle held across his chest. "That's close enough," he shouted. His voice echoed off the barn. The riders shifted. One of them laughed, a low, ugly sound. "Friendly greeting. Thorn," a voice called out. It wasn't the sheriff. It sounded like one of the drifting hands from the Box T Ranch, men who spent their wages on whiskey and violence. "I'm not feeling friendly," Elias called back. "Turn around." "We heard you had company," the voice said. "Heard you bought yourself a little something from the Apache. We just wanted to see if she was worth the price." News traveled faster than telegraph wires. The trader must have been seen, or someone in town knew about the bond and had been tracking Chatto. "Get off my land," Elias said. "I won't say it twice. Now, don't be greedy. Elias, share the wealth." Elias raised the rifle and fired. The shot cracked like a whip, a flash of orange fire blooming in the dark. The bullet kicked up dirt 5 feet in front of the lead horse. The horse reared, screaming. "The next one puts a hole in you," Elias roared. He racked the lever. The riders cursed, fighting their mounts. They weren't expecting a fight. They were bullies looking for easy sport, not a shootout with a man who had dug in. "Crazy bastard," one of them shouted. "Ride!" They turned their horses and galloped off into the darkness, their hoofbeats fading into the wind. Elias stood on the porch for a long time, listening. The silence returned, but it was fragile now. He knew they would be back, or others would. He had just declared war on the men who thought a woman was something you could hunt. He lowered the rifle. His arm was throbbing violently now, the bite wound protesting the recoil. He walked across the yard to the bunkhouse. He didn't try the door. He just stood near it, speaking to the wood. "They're gone," he said quietly. "I drove them off." There was no sound from inside, no movement. "You're safe," he added, though the word felt inadequate. He didn't go back to the main house. He couldn't. If they circled back, or if the woman tried to run in the dark and got lost in the freeze, he needed to be here. Elias sat down on the wooden crate beside the bunkhouse door. He rested the rifle across his knees. The wind bit at his face, but he didn't move. He pulled his coat tighter. Inside the bunkhouse, he heard a sound. It was the creak of the cot springs, then a long, shuddering exhale, then silence. She was sleeping. For the first time, perhaps in months, she was sleeping without the need to keep one eye open, because there was a man outside her door who wasn't trying to get in. Elias leaned his head back against the rough wood of the wall. He watched the stars wheel slowly overhead, sharp and cold. He was tired. He was hurt. He was $300 poorer and in a hell of a lot of trouble. But as he listened to the quiet breathing of the woman on the other side of the wall, the heavy weight of his own loneliness felt, for the first time in years, just a little bit lighter. He closed his eyes, his hand resting on the rifle, keeping a promise he hadn't yet spoken aloud. He would be there when morning came. The dawn did not break gently. It bled into the sky, a bruise of purple and sullen gray over the eastern peaks before the sun finally crested the mountains and set the frost afire. Elias Thorne woke before the light, the habit of a decade dragging him from the warmth of his quilts. His left arm, wrapped in the stiffened, blood-stained bandana, throbbed with a dull, heavy pulse that seemed to beat in time with the wind rattling the window pane. He sat up, the cold air of the room biting at his bare chest. He did not look at the empty side of the bed. That was a discipline he had mastered 3 years ago. Instead, he looked out the window toward the bunkhouse. The door was still shut, the heavy iron bolt presumably still thrown from the inside. Smoke curled thin and white from the chimney he had cleared yesterday. She was still there. Elias pulled on his shirt, wincing as he buttoned the cuff over his swollen forearm. The bite was deep, the jaw strength behind it startling. He pulled on his boots, stomped the heels down, and went out into the morning. There was no heroism in what followed, only the relentless, indifferent demand of the ranch. The cattle did not care that he had a wild woman locked in his bunkhouse. The horses did not care that he was $300 poorer. The fence line in the north pasture was sagging, and the water trough needed scrubbing before the algae bloomed. Survival was a series of chores performed whether one's heart was in them or not. He hauled water, the buckets heavy, his breath pluming in the air. He chopped wood, the axe ringing out against the cedar, the vibration traveling up his arms and settling in his injured wrist. He worked with a deliberate rhythm, making noise, letting his presence be known without being intrusive. When he returned to the main house for coffee, he saw the bunkhouse door crack open. Just an inch, a slice of darkness watching him. Elias went into his kitchen, fried salt pork and heated yesterday's biscuits in the skillet grease. He put a portion on a tin plate, poured a mug of black coffee, and walked across the yard. He set the food on the chopping block near the bunkhouse door, then turned and walked away without a word. He went to the barn to shoe the bay mare. When he came out an hour later, the plate was empty. The coffee was gone. The tin cup had been set back on the block, not thrown, but placed with a precision that suggested a test. He saw her later that morning. She was sitting on the edge of the horse trough, washing her face. She stopped when she saw him, water dripping from her chin, her body going rigid. She did not run, but she tracked him. She watched his hands. She did not look at his face, did not meet his eyes. Her gaze was fixed entirely on his hands, whether they were open or closed, whether they held a tool or a rope. Elias paused by the gate, tipping his hat. "Morning," he said. She said nothing. She wiped her face with the sleeve of the oversized wool shirt he had left for her. It swallowed her small frame, making her look like a child playing dress-up. Until you saw the eyes, they were old eyes. He noticed something else. As she lowered her hand, a glint of metal flashed near her waist. She had taken the paring knife from his kitchen. It was a dull little thing, barely good for peeling potatoes, but she had it tucked into the rope she used as a belt, hidden under the shirt tails. Elias looked at the bulge of the handle, then looked away. He did not ask for it back. If a dull blade made her feel like she owned her own skin, she could keep it. "I'm going to check the north fence," he said, speaking to the air between them. "I will be back by sundown. There is stew in the pot on the stove. Help yourself." He rode out, leaving her standing in the center of the yard, a small, fierce figure against the immense, crushing emptiness of the basin. Days bled into a week. A routine established itself, fragile as spun glass. She existed in the periphery of his life, a shadow that moved when he wasn't looking. She ate only when she was alone. He would find the pot lid moved, the ladle dripping, but he never saw her lift the spoon to her mouth. The silence between them began to feel like a physical weight. On the fourth evening, Elias sat on the porch, mending a bridle. She was sitting on the steps of the bunkhouse, 20 yards away, whittling a piece of sagebrush with a stolen knife. "I need to call you something," Elias said. He didn't look up from the leather. The paper didn't have a name, just a description. Her hands stopped moving. The knife hovered over the wood. "My name is Elias," he said. "You can use it or not." She remained silent. The wind sighed through the eaves of the house. "I can't call you girl," he continued, his voice low and even. "And I won't call you what the traitor called you, the biter." It was a cruel title, a brand of behavior rather than a person. She turned her head slightly. For the first time, she looked him in the eye. Her expression was unreadable, a mix of curiosity and deep, entrenched suspicion, as if names were just another thing men took from you, another handle to grab hold of. She turned back to her whittling, slicing a long strip of bark from the wood. She did not answer. Elias nodded to himself. "All right, when you're ready." The isolation of the ranch was usually absolute, but the following afternoon, dust rose on the road again. Elias was in the barn, pitching hay. When he heard the approach, he stepped out, wiping sweat from his forehead. It was Chato again, this time alone. The Apache trader did not dismount. His horse was lathered, and he looked over his shoulder at the back trail before nodding to Elias. "Rancher," Chato said. "Chato." "I have brought salt," Chato said, gesturing to his saddlebags. "And flour. You will need them." "I have flour," Elias said. "You will need more. You will not want to go to town often." Chato's dark eyes flicked toward the bunkhouse, where the woman was invisible but undoubtedly listening. "There is talk in Salt Lick. The men who held the bond, they have friends, men who handle business in the dark." Elias rested his hand on the fence post. "Let them talk. It is not just talk, Thorn. It is commerce. They say you have stolen property. They say you are keeping a white woman for unnatural reasons." Chato spat into the dust. "The sheriff is listening to them. Boyd likes order. You are disrupting the order." "I bought the paper," Elias said, his voice hardening. "It was a legal transaction. The law in this territory is a line drawn in sand," Chato said. "The wind blows, and the line moves. If you stand against them, you stand alone. No one in that town will sell to you. No one will help you when the snow comes." "I am used to being alone," Elias said. Chato looked at him, a flicker of something like pity in his gaze. "No man is that alone. Watch your back, rancher, and watch hers. They will come for the paper, or they will come for the woman." Chato dropped a small sack of salt and a bag of flour by the gate. "Payment for the water last time," he said. He turned his horse and rode south, keeping to the low ground. The tension in the air ratcheted tight. Elias felt it in his shoulders. He was not a violent man by nature, but he had been a soldier once, a lifetime ago, and he knew the smell of a gathering storm. That evening, the friction sparked. Elias was in the barn, checking the feed bin in the back corner. The woman had come in to retrieve a blanket she had been washing in the trough. The barn was dimly lit, shadows stretching long and distorted across the straw. Elias turned, a scoop of oats in his hand, and realized too late that he was blocking the narrow aisle between the stalls. He took a step forward to move past her, to her, in the dim light. It must have looked like a trap, she gasped, a sharp intake of air that sounded like a tearing sheet. She dropped the blanket. She scrambled backward, hitting the wooden slats of the stall. "Easy," Elias said, freezing. "I'm just moving." But she wasn't seeing him. She was seeing every man who had ever cornered her in a stable, every hand that had reached for her in the dark. Her eyes went wide and white. She let out a sound, not a scream, but a low, guttural growl of pure terror. "Don't!" she hissed. "Don't you check me! Don't you look at my teeth!" "I'm not checking you," Elias said, raising his hands, the grain scoop dangling from his fingers. "I am just feeding the horses." "Liar!" she screamed, the word tearing out of her throat. She looked around wildly for a weapon, grabbing a pitchfork leaning against the wall. She swung it up, the tines trembling in her grip. "I am not stock." "You don't check me like stock." Elias stood perfectly still. The tines were 6 inches from his chest. He could see the madness in her eyes, the absolute certainty that she was about to be handled, inspected, and sold. "Look at me," Elias said, his voice dropping to a calm, flat register. "Look at my hands. I am holding oats. I am going to put them in the bucket. Then I am going to walk out the door." He moved slowly, pouring the oats into the manger. He turned his back to her, the most dangerous thing he could do, and the only thing that would prove him right. He walked to the barn door, his back prickling with the anticipation of cold steel entering his spine. He stepped out into the twilight. He didn't stop walking until he reached the porch of the house. He sat down heavily, his heart hammering against his ribs. She stayed in the barn for an hour. When she came out, she did not look at him. She walked to the bunkhouse, the blanket clutched to her chest, and bolted the door. The next morning, Elias made a decision. He walked into the house and went to the heavy oak chest at the foot of his bed. He unlocked it and took out a small iron key. It was the spare. He found her by the chicken coop, throwing scratch to the birds. She flinched when he approached, the pitchfork incident hanging between them like smoke. Elias held out his hand. The key lay in his palm. She looked at it, then at him. "This is for the chest in the house," he said, "or for the padlock on the tack room, or the gate." He closed her hand around it. Her fingers were cold and rough. "I don't keep prisoners," Elias said. "The door to your room locks from the inside. The gate opens from the inside. If you want to leave, you can take a horse. You can take supplies. If you want to stay, no one touches you without your say. Not me, not anyone." He left her standing there, the key clutched in her fist so hard her knuckles turned white. She tested him that night. Elias was sitting by the fire, reading a month-old newspaper, when he heard the hoofbeats. He went to the window. In the moonlight, he saw her. She had saddled the paint mare, the one she had arrived on. She was riding bareback, leaning low over the horse's neck, galloping toward the open gate and the road beyond. Elias watched her go. He did not run for his horse. He did not shout. He went back to his chair and repacked his pipe. He waited. An hour passed, then 2. The fire burned down to embers. It was near midnight when he heard the slow, plodding rhythm of a horse returning. Elias went to the porch. She was coming back up the drive. The mare was blowing hard, exhausted. The woman sat slumped on its back, shivering violently. She had ridden out into the dark, into the vast, indifferent silence of the high desert, and realized the truth. There was nowhere to go. There was no family waiting for her. There was no town that would take her. There was only the cold, the wolves, and the men who were hunting her. She stopped the horse near the porch. She looked at Elias, her face streaked with dust and dried tears. She waited for the scolding. She waited for him to tell her she was ungrateful, stupid, owned. Elias walked down the steps. He took the bridle gently. "Put her in the stall," he said softly. "Rub her down good, or she'll cramp up." He turned and walked back into the house, leaving the door unlocked. It was a turning point. The next day, she began to work. It wasn't asked of her, and she didn't ask for permission. She simply started doing things. She swept the bunkhouse. She mended a tear in one of his grain sacks. She fed the chickens, moving among them with a strange, quiet gentleness. Competence became her armor. When she was working, she wasn't a victim. She was a force. She kept her distance, eating her meals on the steps while he ate inside. But the air between them lost some of its static charge. Then came the day the flour ran out. Elias knew they had to go to town. He couldn't leave her alone at the ranch, not with the riders from the other night still out there. And he couldn't leave her locked up. "I'm going to Salt Lick," he told her one morning. "We need supplies. You're coming with me." Panic flared in her eyes, but she swallowed it. She nodded once. She went to the bunkhouse and came out wearing the heavy canvas coat he had given her. The collar turned up to hide her face. She had the knife in her belt. The ride to town was silent. The landscape was greening slightly with the spring sage, but the town of Salt Lick looked as brown and desolate as ever. As they rode down the main street, heads turned. Men on the boardwalk stopped talking to stare. Women in bonnets crossed the street to avoid them. "That's him," someone muttered. "That's the one. Keeps a squaw woman," another whispered, though she was white. To them, her trauma made her savage. Her association with the trader made her other. Elias kept his eyes forward, his jaw set. He tied the horses at the rail outside Miller's general store. "Stay close," he murmured. They went inside. The store smelled of pickle brine and sawdust. Miller, the proprietor, was behind the counter. He was a balding man with a face like a dried apple. He stiffened when they walked in. "Elias," Miller said, not offering a hand. "Miller, need a sack of flour, and coffee. Sugar if you have it." Miller looked at the woman. She was standing by a barrel of nails, her head down, her body tight. "I can sell you the flour," Miller said loudly. "But I don't want trouble in here. Best you take your business outside." Elias felt the heat rise in his neck. "My money is the same color as anyone else's. It ain't about the money, Thorne. It's about decent folk not wanting to mix with—" The door banged open behind them. A group of 3 men stumbled in, smelling of cheap whiskey and sweat. It was midday, but in Salt Lick, time was relative to the bottle. One of them, a drifting miner named Pike, saw the woman. He grinned, revealing yellow teeth. "Well, look at this," Pike slurred. "The little wildcat. Heard you were up at the Thorne place." He stepped toward her. The woman backed up against the nail barrel. "Leave her be, Pike," Elias warned, turning from the counter. "Just saying hello," Pike said. "She don't look so wild. Looks like she just needs a firm hand." He reached out. It was a clumsy, drunken gesture, meant to grab her shoulder or perhaps stroke her hair. His hand closed around her upper arm. The reaction was instantaneous. She didn't scream. She didn't pull away. She lunged. Her head snapped forward, and she bit his hand. Hard. Pike howled. He yanked his hand back, blood streaming from the webbing between his thumb and forefinger. "You bitch! She bit me! The bitch bit me!" The store erupted. Pike's friends surged forward. Miller grabbed a shotgun from under the counter. "Get her out!" Miller shouted. Pike raised a fist, his face purple with rage. "I'll kill her!" Elias moved. He stepped between Pike and the woman, shoving the drunk man backward into a display of canned peaches. The cans clattered to the floor with a deafening crash. "Touch her again and you won't walk out of here," Elias snarled. His hand was on the grip of the Colt at his hip. He didn't draw it, but the threat was clear. The room froze. "She's an animal," Pike yelled, clutching his bleeding hand. "Look at what she did." "You put your hands on her," Elias said, his voice shaking with adrenaline. "She is under my protection. Anyone who touches her answers to me." The door opened again. Sheriff Boyd stepped in, his thumbs hooked in his gun belt. He took in the scene, the spilled cans, the bleeding miner, the woman crouching behind Elias with her knife now drawn. "Trouble, Elias?" Boyd asked pleasantly. "Self-defense," Elias said. "Pike grabbed her. She bit me," Pike screamed. Boyd looked at the woman. He looked at the blood. He looked at Elias. "Seems like you're bringing a lot of chaos into my town." "Thorn," Boyd said. "Folks don't like it. Folks say you're harboring a dangerous lunatic." "She's not a lunatic. She's scared. She draws blood again, Elias, and I lock her up. And maybe I look into your land claim. Maybe I find some irregularities." Boyd's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Do the sensible thing. Send her away. Or give her to someone who knows how to break a horse." Elias stared at the sheriff. The corruption was naked in Boyd's face. He was one of them. "Let's go," Elias said to the woman. He backed out of the store, keeping his body between her and the men. They reached the horses, mounted, and rode out of town under a hail of stares and spits. The ride back was brutal. The sun felt like an accusation. When they reached the ranch, the woman slid off her horse and ran into the bunkhouse, slamming the door. Elias spent the evening pacing the main house. He felt the walls closing in. He had publicly claimed her now. He had drawn a line in the dirt. There was no going back to the quiet life he had before. Night fell. The wind howled around the eaves. Elias built a fire in the hearth. He sat in his chair, unbuttoning his sleeve. His own bite wound, the one from the first day, was aching from the tension of the ride. He rolled up the sleeve. The skin was angry and red, the teeth marks still vivid scabs. He dipped a rag in hot water and whiskey and began to dab at it. The front door opened. He looked up, startled. She stood there. She had left the safety of the bunkhouse. She walked into the room, her movement stiff but determined. She stopped across the fireplace from him. She looked at the wound on his arm, the mark she had made. Then she looked at his face. For a long time, only the crackle of the wood broke the silence. "Why?" she asked. Her voice was raspy, unused to forming words. It was the first time she had spoken a clear question. "Why what?" Elias asked gently. "You stood in front of me. I told you, no one touches you." She looked at the fire. "Don't pretend you are kind," she said, the words bitter and sharp. "Kind men don't buy women." Elias stopped cleaning his arm. He looked at her, seeing the layers of betrayal that had built that sentence. "I didn't buy you to save myself," he said. He spoke clearly, without looking away. "And I didn't buy you to own you. I bought the paper because if I didn't, Chatto would have left you there, and I couldn't watch that happen." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "I bought time, that's all. I don't know how to fix what happened to you. I don't know if anyone can, but I promise you this, I won't add to it." She stared at him, searching for the lie. She looked at the blood on his arm, the weapon he hadn't used against her, the door he had left unlocked. She took a step closer to the fire, shivering slightly, not from cold, but from the terrifying proximity of a man who wasn't hurting her. "I can't go anywhere," she whispered. "The snow is coming." "I know," Elias said. "I will stay." She said it was a negotiation. "Until the winter breaks, until the passes are clear." "All right," Elias said. "Until winter breaks." "You stay on your side," she said, pointing to the space between them. "I will." She nodded. She turned to go back to the bunkhouse, then stopped at the door. She looked back at him, a strange, confused expression on her face. "My name is Sarah," she said. The name hit Elias like a physical blow. It was his dead wife's name. "No," she corrected herself quickly, seeing his face. "No, that was before. I am not Sarah anymore." She paused, thinking, I don't know." "We'll find it," Elias said, his voice thick. "We'll find a name." She slipped out into the night. Elias sat by the dying fire for a long time. He listened to the wind. He thought about the winter coming, the snow that would trap them here together. He thought about the way she had looked at him in the store, fierce and terrified, and the way she had looked at him just now. He felt a tightening in his chest that had nothing to do with fear. It was a dangerous, jagged feeling. It was want, not the want of possession, but the want of connection, the want of another soul in the empty house. And that, he knew, was more dangerous than any sheriff or any bite. The winter came down from the north like a curtain of white iron. It began in November with a sky that turned the color of a bruised plum, and by December, the San Augustin Basin was buried under 3 feet of snow. The wind howled around the corners of the ranch house, a ceaseless, mournful keen that sounded like the voices of the lost. The world outside shrank until it was just the house, the barn, and the narrow, shovel-cut trench of a path that connected them. The ranch became an island. The indifference of the landscape turned into active hostility. If a man lost his way between the porch and the corral in a whiteout, he could die 50 feet from his own hearth. Elias Thorne and the woman lived in this suspension. The bunkhouse, though sturdy, was too drafty for the sub-zero nights, and after the first heavy blizzard, Elias had moved a cot into the kitchen of the main house. He slept in his bedroom with the door closed. She slept in the kitchen near the stove, with the back door barred and a chair wedged under the handle. They were 2 ghosts haunting the same small castle, circling each other in the warmth. The confinement forced a proximity that stripped away defenses. Elias saw the shape of her trauma in the small, involuntary flinches that governed her day. One evening, Elias sat by the fire mending a bridle. He was humming, a low, absent-minded sound, a hymn his mother used to sing, Rock of Ages. The woman was across the room, shelling dried beans into a bowl. As the melody became recognizable, she froze. The bowl slipped from her lap, shattering on the floor. Beans scattered like buckshot. She scrambled backward, pressing herself into the corner of the room, her hands over her ears, her eyes squeezed shut. She was rocking, muttering something unintelligible. Elias stopped instantly. He set the bridle down and stayed in his chair, knowing that moving toward her would only make it worse. "It's just a song," he said softly. "It's stopped now." She lowered her hands slowly, her chest heaving. "Not that song," she whispered. "He sang that, the one who held the book while the others—" She didn't finish. She didn't have to. Elias felt a cold sickness in his gut. He realized that for her, piety was not a comfort. It was the prelude to violence. Men had prayed over her before they hurt her, sanctifying their cruelty. "I won't sing it again," Elias said. Another night, he opened a bottle of whiskey to pour into a poultice for a horse with a cut leg. The sharp, amber smell filled the kitchen. She gagged, turning pale, and ran out the back door into the snow, retching. When she came back in, shivering and blue-lipped, Elias had corked the bottle and put it away. He made tea instead, the scent of mint replacing the alcohol. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice hollow. "Don't apologize," Elias said. He was looking at the fire, his face drawn. "I have smells I can't abide either. Burning pine, smells like Georgia." She looked at him, surprised by the admission. "You were there?" "I was with the cavalry," Elias said. He rarely spoke of it. "We burned a lot of things. Houses, barns. Sometimes I think the smoke never really washed off my skin. It was a small exchange, but it shifted the ground beneath them." He was not just the jailer or the savior. He was a man with his own ghosts. He avoided town not because he thought he was better than the people there, but because he feared the part of himself that knew how to burn things down. The tenderness between them grew not from grand gestures, but from the quiet, practical language of survival. One morning, Elias found her boots by the door. The soles were wearing thin, the leather cracked. Without asking, he took them to his workbench. He spent the afternoon resolute soling them with thick, sturdy rawhide and greasing the leather until it was supple and waterproof. He left them by the stove. When she put them on the next morning, She paused. She flexed her feet, feeling the new warmth, the solid grip. She looked at Elias, who was drinking coffee and staring out at the snow. "Thank you," she said. Elias nodded, not turning around. "Winter's hard on feet." 2 days later, Elias came in from the cold to find his wool shawl, the one he used when checking the lines, folded neatly on his chair. It had been washed and mended. A tear in the weave pulled tight with careful, almost invisible stitches. He touched the fabric. It was the first time she had done something for him that wasn't strictly necessary for her own survival. The isolation broke in late January, on a day when the sun came out hard and bright, blinding against the snow. A rider appeared on the ridge. It was Chato. The Apache's horse was wading chest deep in the drifts, and Chato himself looked like a figure carved from ice. Elias went out to meet him, helping him down. They brought the horse into the barn and Chato into the kitchen. The woman did not hide this time. She stood by the stove, a ladle in her hand, watching the trader with wary recognition. Chato drank the coffee Elias gave him, wrapping his frozen hands around the mug. "You are alive," Chato said, looking at the woman. "That is good. The winter kills the weak." "I am not weak," she said. Her voice was quiet but steel hard. "No," Chato agreed. "You are not." He turned to Elias. "I have been in Silver City. I heard things. The men who moved her. They are not just drifters. They are runners for a man named Holloway." Elias went still. "Judge Holloway?" "The same," Chato said. "He owns the copper mine. He owns the freight line. And he thinks he owns the law. He uses the bond papers to move women into the mining camps. It is a business. He does not like that you interrupted his ledger." "He's a judge," Elias said, the anger rising in his throat. "He's supposed to be the law." "He is the law," Chato corrected. "That is the problem. He has sent men to Salt Lick. They are asking questions. They know you have her. They know you bought the paper, but they claim the paper was stolen from their courier. They say you are a thief." "I paid gold," Elias said. "Gold does not matter when the judge holds the gavel." Chato said, "They will come. Rancher, not with a mob this time, with a warrant. They will try to make it look legal." Elias looked at the woman. She had gone pale, her knuckles white on the ladle. "Let them come," Elias said. "I have a deed to this land, and I have a Winchester." "A rifle is good," Chato said, standing up. "But eyes in the back of your head are better." Chato did not stay the night. He rode out while the sun was still high, disappearing back into the white silence. That evening, the fear in the house was palpable. The woman paced the kitchen, checking the window every few minutes. "You should let me go," she said suddenly. Elias looked up from his book. "Go where? There is 3 feet of snow. You'd be dead in a day." "If they find me here, they will hurt you." "They will take your land." "They aren't taking anything," Elias said, "and I am not turning you out." She stopped pacing and looked at him. The firelight cast deep shadows across her face, highlighting the sharp angle of her jaw and the dark, restless intelligence of her eyes. "Why?" she demanded. "Why do you care? You don't even know my name." "You haven't given it to me," Elias said. She stared at him for a long moment. The silence stretched, filled only by the popping of the cedar logs in the stove. "Elena," she said. The word hung in the air. "Elena," Elias repeated. It was a soft name, but she said it with a hard edge. "It was my grandmother's name," she said. "The rest of them, the names on the papers, the names the men gave me, I burned them. Elena is the only thing I have left that they didn't touch." She walked over to the table and sat down across from him. It was the closest she had voluntarily come to him. "You want to know why I bite?" she said. It wasn't a question. Elias closed his book. "Only if you want to tell me." She looked at her hands. They were scarred, rough, and trembling slightly. "They tied me," she said, her voice devoid of emotion, which made it worse. "The first time, they tied my hands and my feet. They put a gag in my mouth, but it slipped. The man, he put his hand over my face to shut me up." She looked up at Elias, her eyes burning with a terrible, cold fire. "My teeth were the only thing loose," she said. "I bit him. I bit until my teeth met. He screamed. He hit me. He broke my nose. But he stopped. For a minute. He stopped. It was the only weapon I had. It was the only way to say no when my voice was gone." Elias felt a profound, aching sorrow for her, but he kept his face steady. He did not offer pity. Pity was cheap. "It is a good weapon," Elias said seriously. "A wolf uses what it has." She looked at him, searching for disgust, searching for the judgment that usually followed such a confession. She found only a quiet, sturdy acceptance. Her shoulders dropped an inch. "Elena," she said again, as if testing the weight of it in this room. "It is a good name," Elias said. The riders came 3 days later. The snow had stopped, but the sky was a flat, glaring white. Elias was in the yard, breaking ice on the trough, when he saw them, 4 men. They wore heavy dusters and rode big, grain-fed horses. They didn't ride like drifters. They rode like men who were paid to be there. Elias dropped the axe and walked to the porch where his rifle leaned. Elena was inside. He heard the bolt of the door slide home. The riders fanned out in the yard. The leader was a man with a thick gray mustache and a tin star pinned to his coat. It wasn't a sheriff's star. It was a deputy's badge from the county seat. "Elias Thorne," the man called out. "That's me," Elias said, holding the rifle loose in one hand. "Who are you?" "Deputy Silas," the man said. "I'm here on behalf of Judge Holloway. We have a warrant for the arrest of a woman in your custody. Charges are theft, assault, and flight from debt." He pulled a folded paper from his coat. "That paper is worth less than the snow it's printed on." Elias said, "She isn't property, and the debt was paid. I have the receipt." "The receipt is for a bond that was stolen," Silas said, smiling thinly. "You bought stolen goods. Thorne, that makes you an accessory. Now, bring her out, and we might forget to arrest you, too." "She isn't coming out," Elias said. "Then we're coming in." Silas nodded to the men on his left. They spurred their horses forward. "Don't do it!" Elias shouted, raising the rifle. He didn't want to shoot. Killing a lawman, even a crooked one, was a noose offense. He fired a warning shot over their heads, the crack echoing off the mountains. It was a mistake. They were waiting for it. As soon as Elias fired, the man on the right raised a shotgun and fired. The spread of buckshot caught Elias on the left side. It wasn't a direct hit, but pellets tore through his coat, shredding his shoulder and knocking him backward off the porch. He hit the frozen ground hard, the rifle skittering away from his hand. "Get him!" Silas yelled. 2 men dismounted, rushing toward Elias. He tried to scramble up, but his left arm was useless, burning with fire. One of the men kicked him in the ribs, flipping him over. A boot pinned his chest to the ground. "Stupid dirt farmer," the man sneered, drawing a heavy revolver. "You should have listened." The door of the house exploded outward. Elena stood there. She wasn't hiding. She held Elias's heavy Colt Dragoon pistol in both hands. The barrel was wavering, too heavy for her wrists, but her eyes were wide open. "Get off him!" she screamed. The man standing over Elias laughed. "Look at that! The little biter wants to play." He started to turn his gun toward her. Elena didn't freeze. The trauma that had paralyzed her for so long collided with a new, desperate need. The need to protect the one place, the one person that hadn't hurt her. She fired. The recoil nearly threw her back into the doorframe. The bullet went wide of the man's chest, but clipped his shoulder. He howled, dropping his gun and clutching his arm. The second man on the ground hesitated, shocked. "I'll kill you!" Elena shrieked, cocking the hammer again with a trembling thumb. "I'll kill you all!" She looked like a demon, hair wild, eyes manic. She stepped off the porch, the gun leveled. Silas, still on his horse, saw the situation turning. His man was down, the rancher was still moving, and the woman was shooting real lead. "Pull back!" Silas shouted. "Get him on the horse! Pull back!" The uninjured man grabbed his bleeding companion and dragged him toward the horses. They scrambled into their saddles. Elias rolled over, groaning, and reached for his rifle. He managed to prop himself up on one elbow. "Go!" he roared. Silas glared at them, his face twisted with promise. "This isn't over. Thorn, you just signed your own death warrant." They wheeled their horses and galloped out of the yard, snow kicking up in rooster tails behind them. Silence crashed back down on the ranch. Elias lay in the snow, clutching his shoulder. Blood was seeping through his fingers, staining the white crust red. Elena stood in the yard, the smoking pistol hanging from her hand. She was shaking so hard she could barely stand. The adrenaline was fading, leaving the cold horror of violence in its wake. She had shot a man. She had stepped back into the world of blood. "Elena," Elias wheezed. She dropped the gun. She ran to him, falling to her knees in the snow. "You're hurt," she gasped, her hands hovering over his shoulder, afraid to touch him. "They shot you." "Help me up," Elias gritted out. "Get me inside." She got her shoulder under his good arm. She was small, but she hauled him up with a strength born of panic. They stumbled into the kitchen. She kicked the door shut and barred it. She got him to the chair. Elias slumped back, his face gray. "Whiskey," he whispered. "And the kit." She moved. She grabbed the bottle she hated, the one that made her sick, and the tin box of bandages. She didn't flinch at the smell this time. She poured a glass for him and drank a mouthful herself, grimacing but needing the fire. She cut his coat away. The shoulder was a mess of torn flesh and embedded lead, but the bone wasn't shattered. "I have to clean it," she said. Her voice was trembling. "Do it," Elias said. She poured the alcohol over the wound. Elias hissed through his teeth, his head tipping back, knuckles white on the chair arms. She worked quickly, cleaning the blood, picking out the pieces of wool and shot with tweezers. Her hands, usually so guarded, were touching him everywhere, his chest, his neck, his arm, steadying him. When it was done and bandaged, the room felt incredibly quiet. The fire crackled. The smell of blood and whiskey hung heavy in the air. Elias looked at her. She was kneeling between his legs, her hands resting on his knees, her face streaked with tears. She hadn't realized she was crying. She looked terrified, but not of him. She was terrified of what she had done, and perhaps of what she felt. "You saved me," Elias said softly. "I shot him," she whispered. "I wanted to kill him. You did what you had to do." He reached out with his good hand and touched her face. It was the first time he had touched her skin deliberately. His thumb brushed the tear track on her cheek. She didn't pull away. She leaned into his hand. It was an instinct, a starving thing seeking warmth. Her breath hitched. She looked at his mouth. The distance between them vanished. The air was charged with a sudden, overwhelming electricity, the collision of violence and survival turning into desire. She leaned forward, her lips parted. She wanted to erase the fear. She wanted to feel something that wasn't pain. Elias's heart hammered against his ribs. He wanted her. God, he wanted her. The months of silence, of watching her strength, of living in this small box with her, it all surged up. But he saw the tremor in her jaw. He saw the desperation in her eyes. She wasn't choosing him. She was reacting to the trauma. She was offering herself because she thought that was the price of safety, or because she needed to prove she was alive. He couldn't take that, not from her. He gently placed his hand on her shoulder and stopped her. "Elena," he said, his voice rough as gravel. "No." She froze, her eyes widening. Rejection flashed across her face, the shame of being unwanted. "Not like this," Elias said firmly. "I want you. You hear me? I want you more than I've wanted anything in a long time. But not because you're scared, and not because you owe me." He looked deep into her eyes, willing her to understand. "I won't take what fear offers. When it happens, it will be because you chose it freely, with a quiet mind." She stared at him, her breath trembling. She pulled back slowly. The shame in her eyes faded, replaced by something else, confusion, and then a dawning realization of what he had just given her. He had given her agency. He had refused to consume her. It was a rejection that felt like an embrace. It was painful. Yes, the air between them was thick with unspent desire, but it was honest. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay." She stood up, her legs shaky. She took the basin of bloody water to the sink. "They will come back," she said, her back to him. "I know," Elias said. "We'll be ready." The news of the shooting reached town before the snow melted. The gossip in Salt Lick turned vicious. It was no longer just that the rancher had a squaw woman. Now, the story was that he had a mad woman, a witch who shot lawmen and had bewitched Elias Thorne into violence. "He paid for her," the whispers went in the church pews. "Bought her soul with gold, and now she's taken his. She's a savage," they said in the saloon. "Needs putting down." The social noose was tightening. Elias and Elena were pariahs, enemies of the order that Judge Holloway and Sheriff Boyd maintained. But inside the ranch house, the world had changed. That evening, for the first time since she arrived, Elena did not take her plate of stew to the bunkhouse, nor did she sit on the floor by the stove. Elias sat at the small kitchen table, his arm in a sling, eating awkwardly with his right hand. Elena ladled stew into her own bowl. She walked over to the table. She pulled out the chair opposite him. The wood scraped loudly against the floorboards. She sat down. She placed her napkin on her lap. She picked up her spoon. Elias looked up. Their eyes met across the simple pine table. There were no words needed. It was a small thing, eating dinner, but in the context of their war, it was a monumental victory. It was a declaration of equality. She was not a servant, not a captive, not a pet. She was the woman of the house, breaking bread with the man who had refused to master her. "Pass the salt?" Elias asked quietly. Elena reached out and slid the salt cellar across the table. Her hand brushed his for a second. Neither of them flinched. Outside, the wind howled again, but the house was warm, and for the first time, it felt like a home. The spring thaw arrived not with a promise of life, but with a vengeance of mud. The snow that had buried the San Augustin Basin for months collapsed into a heavy, weeping slush, turning the hardpack road into a quagmire of adobe glue. The creek swelled into brown, frothing torrents that ate away at the banks, carrying deadwood and the carcasses of winter-killed deer. Elias Thorne and Elena rode into this sodden world out of necessity. The flour was gone, the coffee was dust, and the ammunition box was dangerously light. But more than goods, they needed an end to the siege. They could not live another season waiting for the sheriff to invent a reason to hang them. They rode north, bypassing the hostile eyes of Salt Lick, aiming for the larger jurisdiction of Silver City. It was a 3-day ride through country that fought them every step of the way. The horses struggled in the sucking mud, their breath steaming in the damp, raw air. Elias watched Elena as they rode. She sat her mare with a newfound confidence, her back straight, her eyes scanning the horizon. She wore a hat he had shaped for her, the brim pulled low, and a coat that was too big in the shoulders but belted tight at the waist. She looked less like a captive now and more like a partner, though the shadow of the hunt had never quite left her face. In Silver City, they sought the law. The United States Marshal's office was a brick building that smelled of stale tobacco and wet wool. Marshal Davies was a man who looked as if he had been carved from suet, pale, heavy, and tired. He sat behind a desk cluttered with wanted posters and ledgers, listening to Elias with the expression of a man hearing a story he had heard 1,000 times before. "The bond was paid," Elias said, laying the receipt on the desk. "I paid $300 gold to the trader. The debt is cleared. Judge Holloway's men are harassing us with forged warrants." Davies picked up the receipt with 2 fingers, as if it were soiled. He didn't look at Elias. He looked at Elena. She stood by the door, refusing to sit, her hand resting near the knife beneath her coat. "This is the woman?" Davies asked. "This is Elena," Elias said. "The paper says 1 female servant, indentured." Davies read from his own ledger. "Mr. Thorne, you seem to be under a misunderstanding. A bond isn't just a debt. It's a contract of custody. You can't just buy the paper and burn it. The custody reverts to the court if the terms of service aren't met." "She isn't in service," Elias said, his voice tightening. She is a free woman. Not according to Judge Holloway, Davies said, dropping the paper back onto the desk. The judge has filed a motion claiming you absconded with court property. He claims the traitor stole the bond. The traitor is an honest man. The traitor is an Apache, Davies said flatly. And you are a rancher with a questionable reputation who is currently harboring a fugitive. So you won't help, Elias said. I can't help. It's a civil matter until it becomes a criminal one. And if Holloway issues a federal warrant, I won't be helping you. Thorne, I'll be arresting you. Davies leaned forward. If you want my advice, send her back. Let her work off the time. It's better than getting hanged for kidnapping. Elena made a sound, a sharp intake of breath that sounded like a dry branch snapping. She turned and walked out the door. Elias snatched the receipt from the desk. You aren't the law, Davies, he said. You're just another clerk for the rich men. He followed her out. The street was busy with the midday trade. Freight wagons churned the mud, and miners fresh from the hills crowded the boardwalks. When Elena stepped out, the air seemed to change. She was known here, or at least her story was. The wild woman, the biter. Elias caught up to her. Elena, wait. She didn't stop. She was walking fast, her head down, trying to make herself small, trying to disappear into the gaps between people. But she couldn't. A woman in a silk dress, holding a parasol despite the gray sky, stopped in front of her. She was the wife of a merchant, the kind of woman who sat in the front pew on Sundays. She looked at Elena with a mixture of fascination and revulsion. Is that her? The woman whispered loudly to her companion. The savage? Elena flinched, veering to the right to pass. A man coming out of a saloon blocked her path. He was large, smelling of beer. He grinned. Hey there, sweetheart. Show us your teeth. Move, Elias said, stepping up behind her, his hand on her shoulder. The contact, meant to reassure, made her jump. She was vibrating with tension. He keeps her on a leash. Someone laughed. Whore, a voice muttered from the crowd. Then, a young man, barely 20, spat on the ground inches from Elena's boot. Go back to the reservation. He sneered. Elena stopped. She stopped shaking. She went perfectly still. For a second. Elias thought she was going to attack. He saw her hand drift toward her belt. Then, she broke. It wasn't a scream, it was a collapse of presence. Her eyes glazed over. Staring at 1,000 miles of nothing, she began to hyperventilate. Shallow, panic-stricken gasps. She was dissociating, the present moment becoming too dangerous to inhabit. Elena, Elias said, grabbing her arm. Look at me. She didn't see him. She was back in the wagon. She was back in the rope. Elias cursed. He swept her up, half carrying her through the mud to where the horses were tied. He ignored the jeers, the laughter, the eyes that stripped them both bare. He threw her into the saddle and mounted his own horse, grabbing her reins. Let's go, he shouted, kicking his horse. They rode out of Silver City fast, leaving the civilization behind, but the poison of it traveled with them. They made camp that night in a wash 10 miles south. The air was cold, damp, and heavy with the smell of wet sage. Elena sat by the fire, her knees pulled to her chest. She hadn't spoken since the town. Elias paced the small circle of light. He was angry, at Davies, at the crowd, at himself. We aren't going back, Elias said, feeding a stick to the fire. We'll go to the fort next time, or we'll ride to Tucson. There is no next time, Elena said. Her voice was flat, dead. We have to fix this legally. There is no law for me, she snapped, looking up. Her eyes were red-rimmed, fierce. Don't you see that? To them, I am not a person. I am a thing that is out of place, a dog that needs to be chained. I won't let them chain you. You can't stop them. She stood up, pacing the mud. You want to hide me. You want to keep me in the box. You pulled me away today like I was a child. I was protecting you, Elias argued, his own frustration boiling over. They were a mob. Elena, you can't fight a whole town with a paring knife. I would rather fight than run, she yelled. I hate it. I hate being hidden. I hate that you have to speak for me. I speak for you because if you speak, they'll kill you. Elias shouted back. The words hung in the air, terrible and true. Elena stared at him, her chest heaving. Then maybe I am already dead, she whispered, and you are just guarding the body. She turned her back on him and walked into the dark. Elias let her go. He sat by the fire, head in his hands, feeling the weight of a world that refused to let them be. They returned to the ranch 2 days later, under a sky that threatened rain. As they crested the ridge overlooking the valley, Elias pulled his horse up sharp. Something's wrong, he said. There was no smoke coming from the chimney. That wasn't unusual if the fire had died, but there was something else. The gate was standing wide open. The milk cow, a placid Jersey named Bess, was lying on her side in the middle of the yard. Stay here, Elias ordered, sliding his Winchester from the scabbard. No, Elena said, drawing her pistol. They rode down together, slow, weapons drawn. The silence of the ranch was heavy, pregnant with violence. They reached the yard. The cow had been shot. The chickens were scattered, some dead, others wandering aimlessly. The front door of the house was kicked in, hanging off one hinge, but it was the barn that stopped Elias's heart. Pinned to the barn door with a hunting knife was a piece of paper. It was the bond, or a crude copy of it, smeared with something dark, and hanging next to it, battered and unconscious but alive, was Chatto. The traitor had been strung up by his wrists. His face was a mask of bruises. Chatto! Elias vaulted off his horse. He ran to the man, cutting the ropes. Chatto slumped into his arms, groaning. They were waiting. Chatto wheezed, his eyes swollen shut. 3 of them, Holloway's men, looking for her. Where are they? Elias demanded, scanning the barn, the loft, the shadows. Not far. Chatto gasped. The crack of a rifle shot split the air. Elias's hat flew off his head. A second shot kicked up dirt by Elena's horse. Ambush! Elias roared. He dragged Chatto behind the water trough. Elena, get down! She was already moving, sliding off the mare as the horse bolted. She scrambled behind the woodpile. 3 men emerged from the tree line behind the house. They weren't lawmen. They were hired guns, dusters flapping, faces covered with bandanas. They had used the ranch as a trap. Give her up, Thorne, one shouted. And you can keep your miserable life. Elias levered his rifle and fired. He didn't aim for a warning this time. He aimed for the chest. The man ducked behind a rain barrel, the wood splintering. Cover me, Elias yelled to Elena. He saw her pop up, firing the heavy dragoon pistol with 2 hands. The boom was like a cannon. It forced the men to keep their heads down, but they were flanking. One man made a run for the barn, circling wide to get behind Elena. Behind you, Elias screamed. Elena turned, but she was too slow. The man tackled her. They hit the mud together. The pistol flew from her hand. The terror was instant and absolute. It was the smell of him, stale tobacco, unwashed skin, the rough wool of his coat scratching her face. It was the weight of a man pinning her to the earth, the crushing suffocation of history repeating itself. Gotcha, you little witch, the man grunted, grabbing her hair and winding it around his fist. He yanked her head back. He had a length of rope in his other belt loop. Elena screamed. It wasn't a word. It was a sound of pure, primal horror. She thrashed, her boots scrabbling in the mud. Elias heard her. He broke cover. He didn't care about the other 2 shooters. He didn't care about the bullets that whizzed past his head. He ran across the open yard, a demon of rage. But he was 30 yards away. Too far. The man was tying her hands. He was laughing. Elena stopped screaming. Her vision narrowed to a tunnel. She saw the man's wrist near her face. The radius bone, the flesh. She didn't think. She lunged upward, not to escape, but to destroy. She bit him. She clamped her jaws onto his forearm with every ounce of strength she possessed. She felt the skin tear, the muscle give. She tasted the hot copper of blood. The man shrieked, a high, bubbling sound. Get off! God, get off! He let go of the rope to punch her, hammering his fist into the side of her head. Lights exploded behind her eyes, but she didn't let go. She locked her jaw. She was the wolf now. Elias hit them like a freight train. He didn't shoot the man. He used the butt of the rifle, swinging it in a savage arc that connected with the man's temple. The sound was a wet thud. The man collapsed, instantly unconscious, falling sideways off Elena. Elias stood over him, chest heaving, eyes wild. He reversed the rifle, raising the stock to smash the man's skull in, to finish it, to kill him while he slept. "Elias!" The voice cut through the red haze. He froze, the rifle raised. Elena was pushing herself up from the mud. She was spitting blood, the man's blood. Her face was swelling where she had been hit. She looked broken and terrifying and beautiful. "Don't!" she gasped. "He touched you," Elias snarled, his voice unrecognizable. "He put his hands on you." "If you kill him like that," Elena said, her voice shaking, "you become them. You become Holloway." Elias looked at the man in the mud. Then he looked at the tree line where the other two attackers were mounting their horses, fleeing now that their advantage was lost and their leader was down. He lowered the rifle. He spat on the ground. He reached down and hauled the unconscious man up by his collar, dragging him to the fence. He used the man's own rope to tie him there, tight, so he would wake up in pain and waiting for the sheriff, if the sheriff ever came for justice. Then he turned to Elena. She was sitting in the mud, hugging her knees. She was shaking again, the adrenaline crash hitting her hard. Elias went to her. He dropped to his knees. He didn't touch her. Not yet. He waited. "Are you all right?" he asked. The question was stupid. Of course she wasn't. She looked at him. She looked at the blood on her chin. She wiped it away with the back of her hand. "I am alive," she said. The night fell heavy and black. They had moved Shadow into the bunkhouse, cleaned his wounds, and given him laudanum. The ranch was silent, save for the wind. Elias and Elena were in the main house. They had barricaded the door again. The fire was roaring, pushing back the damp chill of the spring night. Elias was cleaning his rifle. His hands were steady, but his mind was a storm. He kept seeing the man on top of her. He kept feeling the urge to go back out there and pull the trigger. Elena was washing at the basin. She had scrubbed her face 3 times, trying to get the taste of the man out of her mouth. She turned to look at him. "You wanted to kill him," she said. "Yes," Elias admitted. "Why didn't you?" "Because you asked me not to." She walked toward him. She stopped at the edge of the hearth rug. The firelight danced on her skin. She looked exhausted, bruised, and utterly raw. "I was scared," she said softly. "When he grabbed me, I was back there, in the wagon." "I know," Elias said. "But then, I bit him, and I wasn't back there anymore. I was here. I was fighting." She took a step closer. "And you came." "I will always come," Elias said. She looked at him, and the air in the room shifted. The terror of the afternoon began to transmute into something else, a desperate, aching need to affirm life, to prove that her body was her own, and that she could choose who touched it. "Elias," she said. It was an invitation. She closed the distance. She reached out and took the rifle from his hands, setting it against the wall. Then she took his hands. Her fingers were cold. His were warm. "Make me feel real," she whispered. "Please." She leaned in. This time, she didn't flinch. She kissed him. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was urgent, tasting of salt and desperation. It was a collision of 2 people who had nearly been destroyed and were grasping for the only solid thing in the world. Elias hesitated for a heartbeat, his protective instinct warring with his desire. He didn't want to frighten her. He didn't want to be another man taking something. But she pressed closer, her hands tangling in his shirt, pulling him to her. She bit his lower lip, not to hurt, but to hold, a claim. "I am choosing this," she murmured against his mouth. "I am choosing you." That broke him. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her against him, burying his face in her neck. He held her as if she were the only air in the room. They moved to the bed. It wasn't graceful. It was a tangle of boots and buttons, of skin seeking skin. There was no darkness in it, only the fierce, trembling light of consent. He touched her with a reverence that made her shake, and she touched him with a hunger that healed the parts of him that had forgotten how to be touched. The wind howled outside, but in the small room, there was only the sound of their breathing, the reclaiming of territory, the silent vow made in the dark. Morning brought the reckoning. The sun had barely cleared the mountains when the sound of a gathering storm reached them. It wasn't thunder, it was voices. Elias woke first. He went to the window. A crowd had gathered at the gate. There were 20, maybe 30 men, some on horses, some in wagons. Sheriff Boyd was there, and Reverend Carter, a man with a face like a hatchet, holding a Bible like a weapon. "What is it?" Elena asked, coming up behind him, wrapping the blanket around herself. "It's the town," Elias said grimly. "They've come for us." He saw the mood of the crowd. It wasn't a posse, it was a mob. They were shouting, their voices ugly and distorted. "Bring out the witch! Harboring a savage! Sins of the flesh!" Elias turned to her. "We can't stay here. They'll burn the house down with us inside." "Where do we go?" Elena asked. She didn't look afraid anymore. She looked ready. "The mountains," Elias said. "The high country. Chato knows the trails. They can't follow us there." "What about the ranch?" Elias looked at the walls he had built, the home he had tried to make. "It's just wood and mud. Elena, it's not the life." He grabbed his gear. "Get dressed. Pack what you can carry. We ride out the back, through the creek bed." They moved fast. They woke Chato, helping him to his horse. They saddled the mounts, loading saddlebags with ammunition, dried meat and blankets, as they slipped out the back of the barn, keeping the structure between them and the mob. They heard the sheriff's voice booming, "Elias Thorne. By the order of the county, come out! Surrender the woman!" Elias didn't look back. He swung into the saddle. Elena mounted beside him. She looked at the house one last time. Then she looked at Elias. "Ready?" he asked. "Ride," she said. They kicked the horses into a gallop, splashing through the swollen creek, vanishing into the sagebrush just as the first torch was thrown onto the porch of the ranch house. Behind them, the pillar of smoke began to rise, marking the end of their safety and the beginning of their exile. They were no longer rancher and captive. They were outlaws. And they were together. The high country of the Mogollon Rim was a fortress of stone and pine, a place where the air grew thin and the nights carried the bite of winter even in late spring. For 3 weeks, Elias, Elena, and the battered Chato moved like ghosts through the canyons. They slept in shifts, wrapped in damp blankets, their fires small and smokeless, hidden in the lee of rock falls. The land was their enemy and their only shelter. The spring storms that rolled in from the north erased their tracks, turning the trails into slick ribbons of mud that swallowed hoofprints. But the same rain soaked them to the bone, turning every joint into a rusted hinge of pain. Hunger was a constant, gnawing presence. They ate jerked venison that tasted of ash and drank from creeks swollen with silt. Elias watched Elena. She had shed the last layers of the victim he had bought. In the wilderness, she was hardening. She learned to read the wind, to listen for the snap of a twig that meant a cougar or a man. But he also saw the fatigue etching dark circles under her eyes. She was running on adrenaline and hatred, a fuel that burned hot but left nothing behind but cinders. Chato, riding with his arm bound to his chest, guided them. He knew the terrain, and more importantly, he knew where the cracks in Judge Holloway's empire lay. "Ironwood," Chato said one evening, pointing north toward a smudge of smoke against the twilight sky. "There is a man there, a writer. He has no love for Holloway." "A newspaper man?" Elias asked. Skeptical, he was cleaning his rifle, the metal cold against his hands. "Ink doesn't stop bullets." "Chato." "No," Chato agreed. "But silence is what Holloway sells. Noise is what he fears. If we make enough noise, the federal marshals in Santa Fe must listen." Ironwood was a mining boomtown, clinging to the side of a granite gorge. a chaotic tumble of tents, false-fronted buildings, and the ceaseless clamor of stamp mills crushing ore. It was a place of mud and money, where anonymity was easy to buy if you had the dust. They rode in after dark, leaving the horses at a livery on the edge of town. Chatto led them through the back alleys, away from the gas-lit saloons, to a small, clapboard building with a sign that read, "The Ironwood Sentinel, Josiah Reed, Proprietor." Josiah Reed was a small man with hair like a wire brush and fingers permanently stained with printer's ink. He opened the door to Chatto's knock, holding a lantern high. When he saw the Apache, his eyes widened, but he didn't reach for a weapon. When he saw Elias and the woman, he stepped back and waved them in. The office smelled of paper, oil, and stale coffee. Reed listened to their story without interrupting. He sat behind his desk, taking notes with a furious, scratching speed. When Elias finished explaining the bond, the ambush, and the corruption of Sheriff Boyd, Reed looked at Elena. She was standing by the window, peering through the blinds at the street below. "Mrs. Thorne," Reed said, assuming a marriage that didn't exist. "I can print your husband's words, but they are just words, accusations from a man running from the law. If you want this to stick, if you want to bring a man like Holloway down, I need you to speak." Elena turned. The lamplight caught the sharp angle of her cheekbone. "Speak?" "I need your testimony," Reed said gently. "I need you to tell the readers what was done to you. Names, dates, places. I need you to be the witness they cannot ignore." Elena went rigid. To speak was to relive. To tell the story was to invite the world to look at her shame, to judge her not as a survivor but as a soiled thing. She looked at Elias. Elias stepped closer to her, but he didn't step in front of her. He stood at her shoulder, a solid, silent presence. He didn't tell her what to do. He waited. Elena looked at Reed's pen, hovering over the paper. She thought of the man in the mud at the ranch. She thought of the rope. "If I speak," Elena said, her voice trembling, "will they believe me?" "Some won't," Reed admitted. "But once it is in print, it is a matter of record. Holloway can't hide it in a drawer. The governor will read it." Elena took a breath. She walked to the chair opposite Reed and sat down. "His name was not the first," she said. "The first man was a corporal in the army. He sold the paper to a freighter in Tucson. For the next 2 hours, the only sound in the room was Elena's voice and the scratch of Reed's pen. She stripped her past bare. She laid out the geography of her trauma, the price of the bond, the nights in the wagons, the men who prayed before they hurt her. She spoke of the biting not as madness, but as the only language left to her. Elias listened, his heart breaking with every sentence, but he kept his face stoic. He offered her the dignity of his witness. He did not look away. When she finished, Reed was silent. He blotted the page carefully. "I will print a special edition," Reed said, "tomorrow morning. And I have sent a telegram to the federal commissioner in Prescott. He is due here on the stage for the circuit court. We will meet him with this." They stayed in the back room of the printing office, sleeping on pallets of unsold newsprint. The next day, the town of Ironwood woke to a scandal. The Sentinel was on every street corner. Trafficking in the territory, the crimes of Judge Holloway, and the courage of the captive. The reaction was immediate. Whispers followed them when Reed led them to the hotel where Commissioner Eubanks was staying. But these were not the whispers of Salt Lick. These were whispers of shock, of curiosity. The story had transformed Elena from a savage into a victim of powerful men. It gave her a face, but power does not yield without blood. That afternoon, as they walked back to the newspaper office, a shot rang out. A bullet smashed into the wooden post next to Elena's head, showering her with splinters. "Down!" Elias shouted, tackling her into the mud of the street. People screamed and scattered. A second shot kicked up dirt inches from Reed's boot. "The roof!" Chatto yelled, pointing to the livery stable across the street. Elias rolled, bringing his Winchester up. He saw the glint of metal on the roof line. He fired, a rapid covering volley that chipped the brickwork and forced the shooter down. "Get inside!" Elias roared. They scrambled into the mercantile store, crashing through the door. The shopkeeper ducked behind his counter. "They are here," Elias said, breathing hard, checking Elena for blood. She was shaking, but she was unhurt. "Holloway sent his dogs." "He knows," Reed said, clutching his hat. "The story is out. He has to kill the witness before the commissioner holds a hearing." They barricaded themselves in the newspaper office that night. The local town marshal, a man named Cooper who respected Reed, placed 2 deputies at the door, but the night felt heavy with threat. Inside, the air was thick with tension. Chato watched the street from the darkened front window. Reed was pacing, reloading a shotgun. In the back room, Elias and Elena sat on the floor, sharing a tin of cold beans. The near miss had rattled Elena. She had been brave in the chair, brave in the telling, but the bullet had reminded her that the truth was not a shield. "I am marked," she whispered, looking at her hands. "I am ruined. Elias, look at what follows me. Death, violence, everywhere I go." She pulled her knees to her chest. "Maybe the town was right. Maybe I am cursed. Maybe you should have left me in the mud." "Stop it," Elias said. His voice was sharp, cutting through her spiral. He set the food aside and turned to her. The room was lit only by the moonlight filtering through the high, clear-story windows. "You are not ruined," Elias said. "You are scarred. There is a difference. A ruin is something that is broken beyond use. A scar is proof that you survived." "I feel dirty," she confessed, the words tearing out of her. "I feel like I am still theirs. Like no matter what I say, I am just the thing they bought." Elias reached out and took her hands. He held them firmly, forcing her to look at him. "Worth isn't something men can steal. Elena," he said. "They stole your time, they stole your safety, but they didn't touch who you are. I saw you in that chair today. I saw a woman who looked the devil in the eye and didn't blink. That is not a ruined woman. That is a queen." She looked at him, tears spilling over her lashes. She saw the truth in his face. He wasn't trying to fix her. He was seeing her. "Elias," she breathed. The danger outside, the men waiting in the dark, the court hearing tomorrow, the uncertainty of survival, stripped away the last of their defenses. The fear of death clarified the need for life. "Stay close," she whispered. "Please, don't go to the other side of the room tonight." "I'm here," he said. "Closer," she said. She leaned forward, her forehead resting against his. Their breath mingled. She moved her hands up his arms, feeling the solid muscle, the warmth of him. She needed to know that her body was capable of something other than pain. She needed to rewrite the map of her own skin. "I want you," she said. The admission was terrifying and liberating. "Not because I have to, because I choose to." Elias kissed her. It was slow, a question asked and answered in the dark. He laid her back on the blankets. He touched her with a restraint that bordered on reverence, letting her set the pace, letting her guide his hands. When the passion rose, fierce and sudden, she buried her face in the curve of his neck. She felt the urge, the old instinct to fight, to mark, but it changed. She opened her mouth and bit him, right where the neck met the shoulder. But she didn't break the skin. She didn't clamp down to hurt. It was a graze, a pressure, a claiming. It was her saying, "I am here. I am alive. I have teeth, and I am choosing not to use them for war." Elias gasped, understanding the language. He held her tighter, anchoring her to the earth. "I have you," he whispered. "I have you." In the morning, they walked to the town hall for the hearing. It was a makeshift courtroom, a stage usually used for traveling theater troupes. Commissioner Eubanks sat behind a table, looking stern. The room was packed, miners, shopkeepers, and the curious filled the benches. Reed sat at the front table with Elena and Elias. On the other side sat a lawyer from Silver City, slick and sweating. And beside him, Sheriff Boyd from Salt Lick. Boyd looked confident. He wore his badge polished bright. He smiled at Elias, a predatory baring of teeth. "Commissioner," the lawyer began, standing up, "this is a farce. That woman is a fugitive from debt. This man is a thief and an attempted murderer. We have warrants signed by Judge Holloway himself." "I have read the warrants," Eubanks said, his voice dry. "And I have read Mr. Reed's newspaper. Slander." The lawyer waved a hand. "Lies from a hysterical woman. Let her speak," someone in the crowd shouted. "Order." Eubanks banged a gavel. "We demand custody," the lawyer said. "The law is clear. Indenture is a binding contract." The contract was satisfied. Elias stood up, his voice ringing out. "I paid the debt to a savage." Boyd sneered. "Who stole the paper?" "I am right here," Chato said, stepping out from the shadows near the door. The crowd murmured. An Apache in a courtroom was unheard of. "He lies too," Boyd said, his hand drifting to his gun belt. "The testimony is irrelevant," the lawyer said. "The woman is property of the bondholder until released by the court. The court has not released her. Sheriff, take her into custody." Boyd stood up. He pulled a pair of iron cuffs from his belt. "Come here, girl. The fun's over." He stepped toward the table. "No," Elias said. He stepped between Boyd and Elena. "Move, Thorne, or I'll shoot you where you stand," Boyd said. "You have no authority here." Eubanks shouted. "Sheriff, sit down! Judge Holloway is the authority." Boyd yelled. "And he says she comes back." Boyd didn't reach for Elena. He reached for his gun. The room exploded into chaos. "Gun!" someone screamed. Elias shoved Elena down behind the heavy oak table just as Boyd fired. The bullet splintered the wood where her head had been. Elias didn't have his rifle. He had been forced to leave it at the door. He lunged at Boyd. But Boyd's deputy, a man in the front row, stood up and leveled a shotgun at Elias. "Back off!" the deputy shouted. Suddenly, the lawyer, the slick man in the suit, was grabbed from behind. Elena had scrambled under the table. She popped up behind the lawyer, grabbing him around the neck. Using him as a shield, she had the dull paring knife in her hand, the one she had carried for months. She pressed it to the lawyer's throat. "Drop the guns!" Elena screamed. Her voice was not a victim's voice. It was a command. The lawyer shrieked. "Don't shoot! She'll cut me!" Boyd hesitated, his gun trained on Elias. The deputy wavered. "I said drop them!" Elena yelled. She pressed the knife harder. A thin line of red appeared on the lawyer's collar. Marshal Cooper and his men burst through the doors, weapons drawn. "Drop 'em! Boyd! It's over!" Boyd looked at the marshal, looked at Elias, and looked at the woman holding the lawyer hostage. He realized the tide had turned. The town wasn't with him. The law wasn't with him. He snarled and raised his gun to shoot Elias anyway. A final act of spite. Crack! A single shot rang out from the balcony. Boyd jerked. He looked down at his chest, where a red blossom was spreading. He collapsed backward over the bench. Chato lowered the smoking rifle he had smuggled in under his blanket. Panic erupted. The crowd surged for the exits. The deputy dropped the shotgun and threw his hands up. "I surrender! Don't shoot!" Elias scrambled over the table. He grabbed Elena, pulling her away from the terrified lawyer. "It's done!" he gasped, holding her. "It's done." Elena was breathing hard, the knife still clutched in her hand. She looked at Boyd's body. She looked at the lawyer cowering on the floor. She had not been the one to be saved this time. She had held the line. The aftermath was messy. Justice in the territory was never clean. Sheriff Boyd was dead. The lawyer was arrested by Marshal Cooper. Judge Holloway was miles away, safe in his mansion for now, though his reputation was shattered, and the federal investigation that would follow would eventually unseat him. But the cost was there. A stray bullet from the scuffle had struck Josiah Reed in the leg. He sat in a chair, a tourniquet around his thigh, pale but grinning. "Great story," Reed wheezed. "Hell of a story." And outside, the sun was setting over the mountains. Elias and Elena stood in the street. A crowd had gathered again, but they were silent now. They had seen the violence. They had seen the truth. Commissioner Eubanks walked out, holding the bond paper, the original, which the lawyer had foolishly brought as evidence. "This document is invalid," Eubanks announced. "It is a forgery of justice." He handed it to Elias. Elias looked at the paper. It was dirty, creased, and stained with the grease of 100 hands. It was the symbol of everything that had tried to destroy them. He turned to Elena. He held the paper out to her. "It's yours," he said. Elena took it. Her hands were steady. She looked at the words indentured servant. She looked at the debt amount. "Do you have a match?" she asked. Elias struck a lucifer match on his boot heel and cupped the flame. Elena held the corner of the paper to the fire. It caught quickly, the dry paper curling into black ash. They watched it burn until it threatened to burn her fingers, and she let the last cinders drift away on the wind. "You are free to go, Miss," Eubanks said. "The law has no hold on you." Elena looked at the commissioner. Then she turned to Elias. The crowd watched. They expected her to leave. They expected the tragedy to end with separation, or with her fleeing to the safety of a convent or a city back east. Elias stood there, his hands at his sides. He would not ask. He would not demand. Elena stepped closer to him. She reached out and took his hand, interlacing her fingers with his. It was a public claim, a declaration. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, her voice clear enough for the street to hear. "My name is Elena Thorne, and I am going home." Elias squeezed her hand. His throat was tight, his eyes shining. "Let's go home," he said. They walked to their horses, mounted, and turned south, riding side by side out of the town, leaving the ashes of the bond behind them in the dust. The summer sun did not forgive. It hammered the San Augustine Basin with a relentless, white-hot malice, bleaching the bones of dead cattle and turning the mud of spring into concrete. The air hummed with the sound of cicadas and the dull, rhythmic rasp of a saw. Elias Thorne stood on the skeleton of what used to be his front porch. His shirt was soaked through, clinging to his back like a second skin. He was cutting a new beam from a piece of seasoned cedar, the sawdust coating his arms in a fine, fragrant powder. The ranch was scarred. Blackened scorch marks still licked up the stone chimney, and the smell of char sometimes rose from the earth when the wind shifted, but it was standing. Survival had shifted from the desperate sprint of the chase to the slow, aching labor of reconstruction. Elena came out of the temporary lean-to they were using as a kitchen. She carried a tin bucket of water and a ladle. She wore a simple calico dress she had sewn herself, the fabric faded but clean. Her hair was braided back, revealing the sharp line of her jaw and the faint, silvery scar on her cheek where a branch had whipped her during their flight in the mountains. She walked to the porch, her boots crunching on the gravel. She didn't flinch when Elias stopped sawing. She didn't scan the horizon for riders, not immediately. "At least, drink," she said, holding up the ladle. Elias took it, his hands rough and calloused. He drank deeply, the water cool and tasting of the tin. He wiped his mouth with his sleeve and looked at her. "The roof needs tar," he said, "before the rains come, if they ever come." "We need nails," Elena said. She looked at the half-finished wall. "And glass for the window. I won't live in the dark again." "We'll go to town tomorrow," Elias said. The mention of town hung in the air. Salt Lick was no longer a forbidden zone, but it was not a sanctuary. It was a place of uneasy truce. They rode in the next morning. The heat waves distorted the buildings, making the town look like a mirage that might dissolve. Sheriff Boyd was dead, buried in the rocky cemetery on the hill. His deputy, the one who had surrendered, had fled west. A new marshal, appointed by the territory, kept a strict, impersonal peace, but the people remained. As Elias and Elena tied their horses at the rail, the street quieted. It wasn't the silence of a lynch mob anymore. It was the silence of discomfort. They walked into Miller's general store. The bell chimed. Miller, the man who had once ordered them out at the point of a shotgun, was behind the counter. He looked up, his face tightening. "Elias," Miller said. He looked at Elena, then quickly looked at his ledger. "Mrs. Thorne." It was a lie. They hadn't married in a church, but it was a polite lie, a concession to the new order. "Miller," Elias said evenly. "Need 10 pounds of nails, and a pane of glass, 12 by 12. I have the glass," Miller stammered. He moved stiffly. "It'll be $2. As Miller wrapped the glass in brown paper, a woman entered the store. It was Mrs. Gable, the banker's wife. She saw Elena and stopped. For a moment, the old disgust flared in her eyes, the look reserved for the savage woman who had lived in sin and violence. She pulled her skirts closer, as if Elena were contagious, but she didn't say anything. She simply turned her back and pretended to examine a bolt of lace. Elias's hand clenched on the counter. He wanted to shout. He wanted to force them to see her dignity. Elena touched his arm. Her touch was light, grounding. "Pay him." "Elias," she said softly. "We have work to do." They left the store. Outside, a few miners tipped their hats as they passed, men who respected grit more than morality. But others, the church deacons, the friends of the old sheriff, spat into the dust as they walked by. Healing, Elias realized, was not a flood that washed everything clean. It was a slow, uneven thing. It was a wound closing over grit. The ride back was quiet. When they reached the ranch, Elena went to the horse trough. She unpinned her braid, letting her dark hair fall loose. She plunged her head into the water, coming up gasping, shaking her hair like a wild thing, sending droplets flying into the sunlight. And then she laughed. It was a rusty, startled sound. She looked at Elias, surprised by herself. "It felt good," she said, wiping water from her eyes. "Just cold." Elias watched her, his chest aching with a love that felt too big for his ribs. He realized he had been holding his breath for months, waiting for the other shoe to drop, waiting for the tragedy to return. "You should do it again," he said, smiling. But the nights were still hard. Sometimes. Elias would wake to the sound of her gasping in the dark. The nightmares were less frequent, but they were vicious. She would thrash, fighting off invisible hands. He learned not to grab her. He learned to sit up, light the lamp, and speak her name until she came back from the dark. "I'm here," he would say. "The door is locked. You have the key." She would look at him, her eyes wide and unseeing, until the recognition clicked into place. Then she would curl into him, not for protection, but for the reassurance of his heartbeat. One evening in August, a rider appeared. It was Chato. The Apache trader had healed, though he walked with a slight limp now. He did not come to trade. He rode into the yard and sat on his horse, looking at the new beams of the porch. Elias walked out to meet him. "Light and hitch, Chato." "I cannot stay," Chato said. "I am moving north. The army is tightening the reservation lines again. It is time to be hard to find." Elena came out. She walked right up to the horse's flank. She looked up at the man who had brought her here, the man who had said, "She bites," as a warning and a blessing. "You are leaving," she said. "The wind changes," Chato said. He looked at her with a profound, quiet respect. "You have good color. Elena, you look like someone who owns her own skin." "I do," she said. "That is good." Chato gathered his reins. "Watch the southern road. Rancher, not everyone in Salt Lick is resigned to the peace." "Who?" Elias asked. Stepping forward, "Vance Boyd," Chato said. "The sheriff's cousin. He has been drinking in the mining camps. He says you stole his family's honor. He says blood requires blood." "Let him come," Elias said darkly. "He will," Chato said. "Be ready." Chato nodded once, turned his horse, and rode toward the mountains. He didn't look back. He was a part of the landscape, appearing when needed and vanishing when the season turned. The threat didn't arrive with thunder. It arrived with a quiet, creeping malice. 2 days later, Elias found the fence cut in the south pasture. The next day, the water in the trough smelled of kerosene. "He's playing with us," Elias said, standing by the fouled water. "He wants us afraid. He wants us to run." "I am done running," Elena said. She was cleaning her pistol on the porch. Her hands were steady. "If he wants a fight, we give him one." "He'll ambush us," Elias said. "He won't come to the door. He's a coward." "Then we make him come to us," Elena said. "We make ourselves the bait." Elias hated the plan. He wanted to hide her in the cellar. He wanted to send her to the fort, but he looked at her face, the set of her jaw, the fire in her eyes, and he knew he couldn't. To hide her was to insult her survival. They set the stage. They spent the day working conspicuously on the roof of the barn. Exposed, but they wore their guns. And they prepared the ground. Evening came, purple and bruised. The shadows stretched long across the yard. Elias went into the house to light the lamps, making sure his silhouette was visible in the window. Elena stayed in the barn loft, watching the tree line. It happened at dusk. A figure detached itself from the scrub oak near the creek. He moved low, a rifle in his hands. It was Vance Boyd, a heavy, thick-necked man fueled by whiskey and a twisted sense of vengeance. He crept toward the house, aiming for the lighted window where Elias sat. Elena watched him through the loft door. She breathed out, slow and steady. She didn't shoot him from ambush. That was his way. "Drop it!" she shouted, her voice ringing across the yard. Vance spun around. Startled, he fired blindly toward the barn. The bullet smacked into the wood a foot below Elena. Elias kicked the back door open and flanked him. "It's over! Vance!" Vance turned back to the house, swinging his rifle. He was trapped between them. "You killed my kin!" Vance screamed. "You dirty lover of savages!" He raised the rifle to shoot Elias. Elena fired. She didn't shoot to kill. She shot the ground in front of his feet, spraying him with dirt and gravel. It was a shepherd's shot, meant to turn a wolf. "The next one goes in your knee," she yelled. Vance hesitated. He looked at the barn, then at Elias, who was advancing with a shotgun leveled. The whiskey courage evaporated in the face of their coordinated defense. He realized he wasn't hunting victims. He was facing a pack. He dropped the rifle. He fell to his knees, sobbing in frustration and fear. "Just do it," he wept. "Just kill me." Elias walked up to him. He kicked the rifle away. He looked down at the man who represented the last tendril of the nightmare. The rage flared in Elias, the desire to end it, to wipe the slate clean with blood. He looked at Elena. She had climbed down from the loft and was walking across the yard. She held her pistol at her side. "We don't kill him," Elena said. "He poisoned the water." Elias growled. "And if we kill him in cold blood, we poison ourselves," she said. She stopped beside Elias. She looked at Vance with cold pity. "Tie him up. We'll take him to the marshal in the morning. Let him rot in a cell. That is worse than death for a man like him." Elias looked at her. He saw the wisdom in it. To kill him was to admit he was a threat. To jail him was to dismiss him as a nuisance. "Get up," Elias ordered, hauling Vance to his feet. They tied him in the root cellar. The threat was neutralized, not by savagery, but by the discipline of people who had fought too hard for their humanity to trade it away cheap. That night, the adrenaline faded into a deep, exhaustion-soaked quiet. Elias and Elena sat on the porch. The air was cooling. The crickets were singing. The violence was over, really over. Elena looked out at the dark shape of the mountains. "I didn't bite him," she said softly. Elias looked at her. "No, I used to bite because I had no voice," she said. "I bit because I wanted to live, and I didn't know how else to say it." She turned to him. "I don't need to bite anymore. I have a voice, and I have a gun." She smiled faintly. "And I have you." Elias reached into his pocket. He pulled out a folded document. It wasn't a bond. It was a deed. He had written to the county clerk 3 weeks ago, quietly, while she was sleeping. "I have something for you," he said. He handed it to her. She unfolded it in the light of the lantern. It was the deed to the ranch. Owner, Elias Thorne and Elena Thorne. Joint tenants with rights of survivorship. She stared at the words. "Elias." "I didn't buy you to save myself," Elias said, his voice thick with emotion. "I bought that bond because I couldn't stand to watch a life be bartered like cattle. But I stayed. I fought. Because of who you are." He leaned closer. "You aren't a guest here, Elena, and you aren't a servant. You own this. Half the land, half the herd, half the house. If you leave tomorrow, you take half the worth with you. You are beholden to no man." "Not even me." Elena looked at the paper, then at him. Tears welled in her eyes, not the tears of trauma, but the tears of being seen, fully and completely. I'm not leaving, she whispered. I know, Elias said. But I wanted you to know that you could. She dropped the paper on the bench and reached for him. She framed his face in her hands. I want to live with you. Elias, she said. Not survive with you. Live. He kissed her. It was a seal and a promise deeper than any law. The autumn rains finally came in October. They started as a whisper on the roof, then grew into a steady, drumming rhythm that soaked the parched earth. The smell of wet sage and damp dust filled the house. Elias stood in the kitchen, watching the rain wash the last of the scorch marks from the stones of the porch. The fence line was repaired. The cattle were lowing in the near pasture. He heard laughter behind him. Eliana was kneading dough at the table. She had flour on her cheek. She was laughing at something, maybe a thought, maybe just the sheer, impossible lightness of being safe. She looked up and caught him watching her. She didn't flinch. She didn't look for an exit. She smiled, a smile that reached her eyes, bright and dangerous and free. What are you looking at, rancher? She teased. Just admiring the view, Elias said. She walked over to him, wiping her hands on her apron. She leaned against him, looking out at the rain. It's a good day, she said. It is, Elias agreed. He put his arm around her. She rested her head on his shoulder. The old warning from the Apache trader echoed in his mind. Enjoy, rancher. She bites. Elias smiled. She did bite. She bit into life with a ferocity that awed him. She bit back at the world that tried to crush her. And in the quiet, private dark, she bit him gently. A reminder that she was not tame, not property, not a trophy saved from the fire. She was alive. She was choosing, and she was loved. Thank you for listening to Enjoy, Rancher, She Bites. This story of survival, grit, and the hard road to trust in the American West was a journey to write, and I hope it resonated with you. I'd love to know where in the world you are listening from. Please leave a comment below. If you enjoyed this story and want more tales of the frontier, please subscribe to From Wild West. Share your thoughts on Elias and Elena's journey in the comments. Did they find the justice you hoped for? Until next time, keep your powder dry.